Greetings, folkaroos. It's Haley, and welcome back to the final chess meetup recap from this summer. You knew it had to come, folks, but this was still an entertaining meet, and it has a lot of learning moments and also a lot of laughing moments. So, without further ado, let's get into it. And I match up against Barry on the white pieces when I walk in there first, and I start off. Turn the view on real quick. And I start off with pawn to e4. And then, I mean, you've watched these videos for long enough to know the standard responses to e4. You've got e5, you've got d5, you've got c5, you've got c6, right? You've got those. But he plays knight c6. And this is known as the Nimzovich defense, and it's basically the black version of the Van Geet opening with white. It's where you just put a knight out first, and it can go a couple different ways. Like I always put two pawns in the center against this, and it can vary based on which of these pawns black pushes. If black pushes the e pawn, then I would push up and attack the knight, and he would go back. I would go here, 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 and knight c3. That's how that would go. And this is actually, if you can remember, way, way, way back in like June. Remember Melissa? She used to play this opening called the Black Knights Tango, and that's what this transposes back into. And it is very beneficial for white, so that's why I like to do it. But the thing he did in this game was he played this. And I have a decision to make here. What do I want to take and bring the queen out and then play knight f3? Because remember, I think I mentioned last week, in the last video about hitting the queen with a tempo when it comes out, but this is not something you can do in this position because the queen just takes the pawn guarded by the knight. You would have to play knight f3 first, right? You would have to play this first, and then you could get like bishop there and breaking the pin, preparing knight c3, and then you get like long castles. You get like knight c3 and queen a5. You get positions like this. This is also kind of interesting, and this transposes back into a Scandinavian defense. But I push. Here, I just take space in the center, and now it's starting to look a little bit more like a Caro Khan, but with black having the knight on c6, which is the reason why I played this. It's because this pawn structure is beneficial for white to have in the Caro Khan when the pawn is on c6, but when the knight is on c6, it's even better because it's kind of clogging up the arteries over there. So after pawn to e6, white blocks in their bishop, the knight is on a suboptimal square, and I'm very happy. I just developed my knight to f3. He puts his bishop on d7 like this. Development by him is just all wrong. Like all the pieces are tripping over each other here. Bishop to d3 by me is also a little bit inaccurate because it allows him to punish the positioning of the bishop by playing knight to b4. And I thought for a little bit here. I was like, okay, do I want this to be taken? And if so, which piece do I want to recapture with? And I ended up, for some reason, not deciding on going back to e2 and then just playing c3. I just wasn't as patient as I usually am and instead just go c3 and allow Barry to collect the bishop pair. And my justification for this was that I have much better control of the center and a good lead in development, and I'm going to castle on the next move. That was my justification for this. He plays c5 and immediately tries to crack at my center, but I can just castle here. And if he takes, then I'm perfectly happy to take with either this or this. I was thinking of taking back with the pawn and playing knight here, but taking back with the queen is good too. It's really, really not that bad for white. But castles, and then he plays c4. He makes a very committal decision with his own pawn structure here, forcing my queen back to c2, and then developing his knight to c7 to e7 because if he had his pawn on c5 and then he played this, he'd be blocking the bishop's guard of that pawn. So he wanted to be a bit careful that he wouldn't drop the pawn when he rotated out here. And now this is another moment where a decision has to be made. Which way do I retreat the bishop? Do I go back to h4 or do I go along this diagonal, right? And I was worried about a move like f6. Or no, I actually wasn't worried about a move like f6 at all because you'd get this, this, and this hitting the rook. And then when the rook moved out of the way, there's queen h7 putting pressure on the rook. And I'm threatening takes, removing the guard of the rook, and then taking this. And the best move is actually queen to b6, right? The best move is actually queen to b6 because uh, you can't play rook to g7. So yeah, queen to b6 takes, right? Audience moment. Instead of taking back, what is the best move for black? What is a very, very convenient intermezzo that black has to get rid of the queen before they take back my bishop so they won't lose the rook? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is rook to g7, using the bishop while it's still there, chasing the queen back, and then recapturing the bishop. Black is still losing, but that is a very useful intermezzo to have. Bishop g5, and I decide to retreat the wrong way because I get chased back with g5. And I may be like, well, if you went to bishop f4 and then g5 happened, you just go back to c1, right? Like that, what's the difference here? Bishop h4, g4. Well, the difference is if after g5 and the bishop is here, I have these three different squares that I can retreat to. But after my bishop is on h4 and g5 happens, I have to go back here. And then he can play knight f5, attacking my bishop, right? And literally trying to secure two bishops against two knights endgame, which would be quite advantageous for him. And there's really no good way that I can capture this back because I'd have to damage the pawn structure in front of my king either way. There's no piece that I could use to defend the bishop. So I settle on going knight d to e2. And instead of taking, he throws in g4. And I can't rotate back out here because he has double control. And I can't go back here because I just took up that square. So I have to go to e1 here. Now, my knights are just kind of banished to the shadow realm here. And he can continue on with queen to g5 and then start pushing this pawn, right, to try to trap my bishop. And it's just super duper bad for him. The reason queen g5 had to be played was because if he tries to push the pawn right here, then I can play bishop f4, right, and just prevent the queen from getting involved in any way. But yeah, then he plays bishop to e7, which is a pretty slow move. But I react to it in the wrong way. I play f3 because I'm trying to chip away at this, and I'm trying to probably take with the rook, and then like maybe get involved here. Maybe rook protects bishop. Maybe knight gets back involved on f3. But I do allow bishop to g5. Looking at the e3 square, right? So bishop to f2 would have to be played to guard that, and then he could start pushing the pawns. This is what he should have done here, but instead he plays knight takes g3 now, and I have to do this, and then we get h5. The pawn is coming, and I make another bad decision here. I take the pawn, giving myself the infamous triple the pawns in front of my king, and instead of taking back, right? Instead of taking back, what he should play here again is bishop to g5, looking for e3. But an interesting thing, instead of taking here, what I should have done was go b3. Now I have to chip away at this pawn structure, seeing as there's nothing he can do over here. And if he tries to push and open up things like this, then f takes g4 now is a free pawn. And if this, then rook f3 and I can take back, and I have control of the h file, and I can rotate my knight, put the king up on e2, and go over here. And I just kind of, open my airways a little bit. Also, I'm challenging this over here. But a funny thing that could happen is if he takes, I take, opening up the rook, bishop to b5, attacking my rook, and I block the bishop. If that happens, that's a bad move because takes, and if I take back with the pawn hitting the bishop, he has queen takes d4, which is a check. And if I go to h1, which is the only square that I can go to, audience moment, how can he continue the attack on my king? And after this move, it is actually a checkmate attack, a checkmating attack. It's a very innocuous looking move, but how can he attack my king in this position? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is h4. Blundering the bishop, supposedly. But of course, there's takes, rook, queen. So it's just mate after the queen blocks on h7. But if white doesn't have two brain cells and takes the pawn, then that's mate right on the board. And, if white does nothing, like let's say white tries to I don't know. They can't even get in the way of the queen's diagonal because they control all those squares. The best move for white is king h2, taking back with the king, the blundering bishop h4, bishop takes knight check, and then it's just mate after queen h7. That's crazy. But he takes back the pawn. He takes back the pawn, opening up the file for his rook, and I'm able to swing back in the game. But I play queen to d1, targeting the pawn, and he plays f5. Audience moment. I'm not going to give you a hint on this one. What's wrong with this move? What is wrong with this move? Why is f5 a bad move? And if you're able to figure it out and recall the en passant rule, boom. And you're like, well, that's just an exchange. What's so bad about that? The follow-up, queen takes g4. And the queen is coming to g6, and the rook can't stop it. And if the rook tries to stop queen g6 this way, then either queen check on the back rank or queen f4 targeting the rook and double attacking this. And if the rook tries to stay and protect the bishop, then knight e to f3 and knight h4. Uh-oh, it's pretty much over. We got very temporarily forgot about en passant here, which en passant will come up a couple more instances in this video. But yeah, he forgot about it there. Queen takes g4, and then he just blunders queen g6, king f8. By the way, audience moment, king e7 is checkmate in 2. Where is the checkmate in 2 in this position? And if you're able to figure it out, queen takes bishop, and queen f7 is a very easy checkmate. Queen to g6, right? We go back to the game, king f8. I take with the rook, obviously, because if I took with the queen, that would be like the absolute moronic decision. Because why am I, making like the more even material trade? Why not just have a queen? And by the way, he does have to sack his queen here, because if he goes here, it's mate right there on f7. So he has to give up his queen. And then queen e5, right? I could have taken the rook right here, but I throw in queen e5 first. And if he goes down to cross protect the rooks, queen takes d5, hits this and this. And obviously, if this happens, then I'm bringing the knight and the rook. It's just over for him. So I throw this in, and then I take the rook and he resigns. Actually, he resigned before I took the rook, but, that's what I would have done. And that is how I played my first game against Barry. And afterwards, I moved on to a very interesting opponent. I have never seen this guy before. He's another new attendee of the meet. And he was rather soft spoken, but he wasn't really as soft spoken as James. He still talked a little bit. And unfortunately, I forgot to catch his name. I don't know why I don't ask people's names, but I show up, and I'm on the white pieces again, by the way. And I show up to the board, and he has the audacity to play the Karo Khan. He has the absolute audacity to play the Karo Khan against me. I mean, he's never seen me before in his life, so I can have mercy on him in that respect. But we get into a standard advance, and of course, I have to hit him with my tall variation. And I was like, what does he know? And he plays the main line, which is not what I advocate for, by the way. What I play is I play h6 and bishop d7 against the tall variation. But he plays the main line, h5, bishop d3 takes an e6. If Shane played this over at the other meet, I couldn't be a happier person. But this is an opponent that I have no idea whose strength it is. And him knowing how exactly to play against the tall variation kind of frightened me a little bit. I was like, oh boy, what am I getting myself into? Knight f3 is the main move here. And here, the main move is a very weird one. It is queen to a5 check. And basically the idea of it is anything that white blocks with kind of hurts their position a little bit. Like if white blocks with the bishop, then that bishop is very passively developed instead of going to f4. If white blocks with the knight, they get in the way of their bishop. If white blocks with the knight here, they get away the way of their pawn. If they block with this here, they get in the way of their knight. It's just like forcing the pieces in front of each other, right? So, but yeah, he plays knight to d7, which is usual. He's trying to go for this f6 break, which is very common against the Karo Khan. But I play c3, getting my connect 4 pawn structure. Knight e7, queen to b6. This is a standard move, of course, preventing development of this bishop. And actually, in this case, it would be really bad if I developed the bishop because queen takes b2 is a fork on knight and rook. And the only move that I could play would be knight to c2, right? Just defending both. So after knight e7, I play knight a3 because less known about rotation in these kinds of structures is to play knight a3 and knight to c2 just to guard your d4 pawn a little bit more. And seeing that this knight temporarily stepped in front of the bishop, I decided now was the best moment to make that rotation, and the computer agreed with me. Queen to b6, knight to c2, and then he tries to crack away with c5. And I castle. It's basically just like the last game. If you want to take me, then take me. Nothing is happening to my pawn structure, and now I'm going to use the C file against you later in the game, right? Knight f5, and then I start pushing the pawn. I'm like, I'm just going to take space on the queen side. Basically, I'm saying your queen is misplaced. I want it off of this file so I can move my bishop, right? He goes a5, preventing that. But what he does is he creates a huge hole on b5. And I immediately try to take advantage of that by playing knight a3 and knight to b5 and trying to anchor myself onto d6. But this was a mistake, apparently. What I should have done was bishop to g5, but I didn't play this because I thought f6 could just very simply be played here. But apparently, the computer likes my position after going back, taking with the bishop, and then taking with the knight. It just likes my super powerful knight here. I don't like even for the cost of just completely giving up this pawn, but I'm not. That actually traps the queen. Queen a2 and queen to b5 leads to mate. I didn't see that. But yeah, knight a3. He plays c4, kicking my queen back. This game, in a lot of ways, looks almost exactly the same as my previous game. Like it's a very similar pawn structure, very similar piece play, that kind of thing, right? Bishop e7, knight b5. I'm just keeping my eye on this d6 square for now. And he gets a pawn on the side of the board. But that's actually really not that bad for me because I can take my chance right now, try to crack away at the head of the pawn chain, boom, and queen takes, right? And now I'm just dominating the queen side. There's really no part of the board here that he has an advantage at. But after this, I thought the refutation was to check because his bishop escaped that square. But that is not the refutation because the king actually steps aside and it's safer on f8 than it is on e8 because I can't really very easily start an attack on that f7 pawn guarded by the knight. So what I should have done here is play rook to b1, just defending my pawn to mobilize my bishop, kick this bishop out, and then probably done something with this rook. Rook to b1 is an insane move. It's like a GM kind of move that people would play. But bishop e7, I don't want my bishop to be taken and the pawn structure to be doubled, so I just go back to my outpost. Pawn to g6. This move I didn't like by him because why are you doing this? I understand you have your bishop, but why? Like, why? Just why do that? b3 now, I'm taking advantage, right? I'm doing what the computer wants me to do. Queen to c6, and I take. And that apparently was a bad move. What I should have done was get this trade. Because after this trade, the computer's just like, well, now he has weak dark squares literally all over the board, and you can use your queen to take advantage of that in the end game. That's kind of the idea. B takes c4 and queen takes, and this enters into a very strange tactical place, right? So I go here. What I should have done was play this, looking to get this trade and attack the queen. And when the queen moves, then I can go back to my outpost and get that, right? That's better. And I can play rook to b1 and try to intensify pressure on b7. But I play knight to d6 now. I'm like, well, this can't be so bad, right? But I completely missed this. And if bishop to d2 were to be played in this position, audience moment. What is a crazy queen sacrifice that he could play in this position that prevented me from just simply playing bishop to d2? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is queen takes pawn because my queen is completely unprotected, right? And my position is in ruins. But I play rook to b1, just attacking b7. And I'm like, well, if you're going to take my pawn, then I'm going to take your pawn, you take my pawn, and I take your pawn, right? I'm just completely winning. And he agreed with me. So he played b6 and defended the pawn. And I played bishop to b2. He took. But this was all part of my plan. Audience moment. How can I perfectly punish this move? And what trap of mine did he walk face first into? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is c4. Look at who lines up perfectly for the bishop. If it was on d2, that wouldn't be possible. Rook takes c4, boom, boom, boom. And he can play f6 and just try to imprison my bishop on the side of the board. But I attack this. Apparently what I should have done there is just go for a trade of rooks, because if this rook moves, then I just have a huge like attack on this back rank. But I go here, forcing him to do this. Audience moment, how can I best use this bishop to win as much material as possible for it before he plays king to g8 and wins it? How can I win the most material for it? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is boom, sacrificing it for two pawns and then getting this pawn, right? Knight to g4, d7. And he resigns in this position because his pieces cannot stop the pawn. The rook cuts that off. The rook can't go up. And he doesn't have any attack on my king. This isn't a check, so he just literally resigns in this position. Just he had no idea that c4 was coming, and less than 10 moves after that, he lost. I almost said he died. He died on over the board. he lost the game, right? And that was a fun one. And we match up again, and I was like, "Hey, you want to change colors?" And he was like, "No, it's fine." And we played another game, my third game in a row, with the white pieces. And here's how it went. Oh, I wanted to change things up since I'm on the white pieces again, so I played d4. He goes knight f6, and we get into quite a bit of theory. Boom, 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 boom. This is known as the four pawns attack, right? I think I've advocated for this before. And essentially what it's trying to do is it's trying to break in on e5 and then use this pawn chain to block out the bishop while maintaining a semi-open or an open d file, right? That's kind of the way that you're trying to strategically play this opening. And what black should do against this is play c5, right? Because what you're trying to do here is remove one of the pawns that is going to support this pawn pushing up to e5. So if white pushes up to d5, they make a concession. It pretty much means that they're never going to be able to play e5 safely. And then black plays e6, challenging that pawn. So this is a multi-layered strategy. It's forcing one of the supports for e5 to push up, and then once it pushes up, attacking it immediately with the pawn. And then after white develops the bishop, you then take, c takes, and then you play knight b to d7, and you just control this e5 break, and this diagonal remains open. This is the ideal way for black to play against this. And what white would normally do is castle, rook e8, and then do something like queen to c2, a rook here, and then bishop to d2, and just develop rather passively. And then at some point, possibly trying to get this f5 move in. This is kind of the meta of the four pawns attack, but he makes a mistake right away because he plays knight b to d7. And this attempts to put an extra piece on that e5 square, but it actually just enables e5 completely. It just enables e5 completely. And if takes, then I would just take and hit this, and his knight would have to go back to e8. Right, he could try to chip away at this. I would do this, and if you play this, then I could push to e6 and hit the knight to b6, and I am just like, no one is like no player with the white pieces. Like I would probably be able to beat Magnus Carlsen in this position. Don't quote me on that, but I think I'd be able to beat Magnus Carlsen in this position as the white pieces because it is just so easy to play. You're going to get the connect 5 pawn structure, and you're just completely shutting out 2 or 3 whole pieces from like doing anything effectively. But knight b to d7, and I go bishop to e2. I delay e5 by 1 move. I don't know why I do that. And he goes back. He doesn't go back to e8. He instead takes, which is not the right decision for some reason. Uh, I think the reason why is that now, oh yes, the reason why you have to go back here instead of taking first is that you have more tension against this pawn, and white now has to worry about it for the rest of the game, right? Like there's pawn tension here, but the way you do it in the game, there's no pawn tension here. There's no d6 pawn. The knight just has to go back, and this bishop just eats those pawns forever. Like that's kind of the idea. A lot of like very positional meta play discussion going on here. Castles, bishop b7. He's you trying to use this other diagonal. I developed very passively. What I apparently should have played in this position was king h1. Just yeah, I don't. No, I'm not playing that. Bishop to d2, c6. He just put his bishop on b7 and immediately blocked it in with c6. I was like, bro, what are you doing? Like, uh, I've queen to c1. I construct the battery trying to trade down this bishop, and apparently that was a very terrible move because now c5 can be played, striking at my center and reopening the diagonal. What I should have done there was bishop to f4, just saying, hey, you let me have this pawn in the center. I'm going to defend the crap out of it. But yeah, he plays e6, which is a very bad move because having this pawn here, you want to at some point challenge it with f6. If you play, I mean, not right now because then e6 can be played, but if you play e6 right now, that just creates a massive hole on f6 for the rest of the game. Bishop, I don't know why I'm getting so passionate about this. Rook to c8, right? And now we get funky. Knight e4. I'm just putting another piece to try to look at these dark squared weaknesses, freezing a bunch of his pieces. c5. He plays c5, which is a good move. It strikes at the center and hits my knight. And I have to find boom, which I do find. And then the best move is queen to e3. Just guarding this, and everything's fine. But I make a mistake. I go here, which is bad because of h6. And if I went back to here, then boom, boom, and boom. And now my pawn is going to be a target for the rest of the game. Like you're like, well, I can just defend it. How are you going to defend this for the rest of the game? Queen f4? Like queens, like how are you going to defend this pawn? What has become your greatest asset has now become your greatest weakness, and you need to attack the rook. So, and gain a pawn, fortification on this side of the board and try to attack over here. This pawn has turned into a huge liability and it just falls off the board. That's what he should have done in this position after knight g5. But instead, he plays c takes d4, allowing me to take on d4 and threaten something big. Knight takes c5, loses the game on the spot. Audience moment. What is a way that you can sacrifice one of the knights, force him to take back, and then win the queen on the next move? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is either knight taking the pawn. In the game, I played knight d takes e6, hitting the queen and the king. And the pawn has to take back, and then I take, hitting the queen and the king. But the best part about it was king to g8, audience moment. Where is the checkmate in one in this position? Instead of taking the queen, I bad mannered him and checkmated him in one move. Find the move. And if you're able to find it, checkmate. And I left a bad taste in his mouth after that one, and I moved on to play James. And boy, folks, let me just be upfront with you guys. I was disappointed at my performance in this one. I was finally on the black pieces. I requested the black pieces. We still did one of those random draws, but luckily I got the black pieces. So I was like, okay, here's my chance to shine. This is my last chance this year. C4. He apparently is a fan of the English opening. And I was just like, oh my God, trying to recall like, E5 lines where you can get like this reverse Sicilian kind of look. I'm just like, I don't want to go into all that. I'm just going to play the mirrored English, develop my knight to c6, get this pawn structure, and then play g6, bishop g7, knight f6, and castle. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to play this in like a very solid center structure with a fianchettoed bishop on this open diagonal. That's what I'm going to do here. He goes g3, and this is actually one of the main lines of this symmetrical English where both sides get this cute little setup of all their pieces. on the king side, right? Bishop g2, bishop g7, castles, knight f6, knight c3, and castles, and we both get it. And the position is literally symmetrical, folks. The position is exactly symmetrical. So the question is, what does white want to do? And James in this position goes for a3. And the goal of that is pretty obvious. The goal is to play rook to b1 and play b4, because this pawn chain, I have committed to this pawn chain, and if this pawn chain is broken up, he will be better. This is how James thinks. He is just an absolute positional mastermind at my level. Rook b1, b4. This is my win condition. This is what's making my position good. And also, rook b1 steps out of the way of this diagonal in case it opens up in the future. This is inside the mind of James, everybody. Bishop to g4, right? Rook b1, he steps out of the way, and then I play a5, stopping that. But apparently that was too much of an overreaction. Apparently what I should have done was just go queen to d7. And after queen to d7, b4, I don't take, but bishop h3. Getting this trade right now, occupying this, and then he doesn't take, because then that wouldn't really accomplish anything. But what he would do is play knight to d5. And if takes, then takes. And this whole thing, that like my bishop might open, sure, but b takes c5 and his rook now comes alive. Luckily that didn't happen. I played a5. He played rook e1, possibly trying to go here. And I have a decision to make. Do I want to play d5 and break up my pawn chain to try to combat this e4 break that he wants to do? Or do I just try to play slow by going here? Well, what I decide to do is play this! This is the very much wrong time to play this, because the bishop is not my main concern right now. What I should be focusing on is this e4 break going to be any good for him? And d5 might have had some merit, because after this, and knight takes, queen takes, if he plays e4 in this position, that opens up a pin and this can happen. So this is getting quite complicated. The meta discussion is, again, very complicated. But knight d to d7, he goes knight b5. I was just looking at that move and I was like, what is he doing here? What is he trying to prepare? And I couldn't really figure it out. So I just go a4. I'm like, well, if I can take more space on the queen side and then possibly rotate my knight into b3, this looks very fruitful. And at this point, you might be like, well, Haley, didn't you say that you were disappointed in your performance in this game? This looks like a very elite level game. Well, this part is, but the rest of it isn't, as you can see with all these symbols over here. Bishop to d2 by James, right? He's stopping my knight from going here. So then I play knight a5 anyway. And I'm like, well, if you're going to take me, then you're going to get rid of like a good asset in your position. And I'm going to be doing all right here. But audience moment, what did I blunder by playing this? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is the a4 pawn. I just blundered the a4 pawn, and now my knight is just looking really silly on that square. And I would have to go back here, and queen d1 and just be down a pawn against James, and you know how that works out for most people. Bishop to c3 from James here, and I play f6. I really, really don't like the idea of trading the bishops here. Because this just leaves my king like completely exposed on all these squares. I just don't like the idea of creating this little post for my bishop, but then trading it off. That just seemed like very bad to me. So bishop to c3, I block it with f6, but that's apparently an even worse mistake because of queen takes a4. But he doesn't find it again. He plays h3. I knew he saw this. He probably just didn't want his queen lined up with the rook. But h3 is played because my knight instead of my queen is here, so that h3 pawn actually hits the bishop. So it has to go back to e6, temporarily blocking this pawn, and I'm going to have to spend a tempo playing bishop f7 at some point to get out of the way. Knight to d2. So now, right, I don't want my knight to be taken. So here, and then he plays b4. And again, like I said, en passant is going to come up. Boom. Should have played this. Because if knight takes, if knight takes, then apparently knight to b6 and this is good, hitting the bishop. If queen takes, then bishop to f7 and maybe e5 would have been good. There's just like a bunch of things black could still do. Even taking might have some merit like this because maybe this would happen and you get that. But instead, I go knight to b6 now, which just blunders the game away. But he misses it on this move, but on the next move he finds it because I don't fix it. Bishop to a1. Now I was extremely like puzzled at what that move might be trying to do, but I think what it's trying to do is it's trying to open up a square for the knight and also the c file. It's trying to take, and then play along the c file because maybe the semi-open file would be useful for him here. Also, bishop to a1 is a defended square, and this wouldn't be a defended square if the knight happened to move. Right? These are just kind of my guesses. So I play d5. I'm like, well, if I can get a pawn here, that's fine. If I can get takes and knight takes, that's all right. If I can trade the bishops on this diagonal, that's all right. But I blundered a huge, huge, huge capture. Audience moment, what capture did I blunder? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is this. And at this moment in the game, I believe it was Gary, was playing a game against the person that I played before this. And he said, can I play en passant in this position? He had a pawn on this rank, and his opponent, his opponent had a pawn here, and he pushed a pawn one square next to it. And, oh my God, I'm getting so confused. So Gary was the one who wanted to en passant. So his opponent did this, right? And his pawn was here, and Gary was like, why can't I en passant? Or can I en passant? And I said, no, you cannot, because the pawn has to go two squares up, and it has to be the first opportunity that it can move. So Gary was like, God dang it, I didn't know that en passant rules. They only the two move kind of thing. And then James was like, yeah, it's only two moves. So yeah, but then I come back to the board all distracted, trying to like remember my en passant rules because the way Gary demonstrated the position was a bit unclear because he was just like the two pawns on those squares, and I was like, wait a minute, what? You're trying to say what now? And I got a little bit distracted, and I come back to the board. I barely even look, and I play 95. I'm just like, well, I'm trying to target this with three pieces, and then I just lose my knight, and I resign. Oh my god. Okay, yeah, that was. Let's not dwell further on that game, and let's go to the last game that I played in this meet, the finale of them all. As another matchup against Barry, and this time I was on the black pieces. And he is also a fan of the birds opening, it turns out. And I do what James does against the birds opening, d5, knight f3, knight f6, and d4. This is a mistake. This is what I consider a mistake in the birds opening because you just create a gaping hole on e3, and this pawn is now permanently a backwards pawn if you play bishop to f5. This is just a very dominant structure. And then what would have to commit to this, which is just like this square is going to be weak for the rest of the game, e6. And you can see here that black allows this because the pawns support that square. And we get queen to d7 supporting the pawn and then castles and rook e8. And black will have control of this square for the rest of the game. That's why it's a mistake. But after d4, I play bishop to g4 because I'm like, well, I can play like e6 and c5 and then knight c6 and then maybe I can take. Also, I'm threatening to damage the structure if he doesn't like push, so I'm forcing him to commit the e-pawn basically. Which he doesn't. He instead goes here, defending the knight, but blocking in the bishop. So I was like, sure, this is a temporary thing that he can do. I'm just going to play e6 and c5, just trying to strike at his center here. Bishop to e2, breaking the pin. So I develop. He plays c4. This is a bad move. It's a bad move because rook c8. And if he takes, I create the semi-open or the fully open, depending on what happens with the pawns, c file. And if he does something like castle, then I have the semi-open file, and it's in my favor because I'm just going to move the knight, and I'm going to have a huge target here with that pawn. Like if he takes back, d takes c4, knight takes c4, and I could even play bishop f3 and then take here. And now I'm hitting this, and I'm hitting this, and this is defended by the queen. The c file in Caro-Kann positions can be, or positions that are kind of like Caro-Kann positions, because I played e6, c5. Very venomous. The c file can be very venomous if you find the correct way to open it. But I play queen to b6 because I'm too focused on this pawn, and I'm too focused on, constraining the development of that bishop. Castles, c takes. He takes with the knight, and I punish this perfectly. Audience moment. Can you find the sequence of moves that I use? This is a very difficult one. Can you find the sequence of moves that I use here to win a pawn? There's two different sequences that you could find. And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is takes. If queen takes, then take, and take wins a pawn. If knight takes, then takes wins a pawn. If you can play this first, and if this, then this, king h1, and this wins a pawn. But yeah, here, if this happens, knight takes g4, queen takes, and knight c2 wins a pawn. Because it attacks this, and it's pinned, and it hits the rook, so the rook has to move. And then knight takes e3 is even worse. So that wins a pawn and an exchange. But yeah, I punished it by doing this, boom, 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 right? And I win a pawn, and then I go here. I don't know why I did that. I honestly have no clue why I did that. What I should have done was play bishop to d6, just maintaining the threat on this pawn while I castle. Bishop to c5 doesn't really make much sense because what am I targeting? Like, am I just super duper preventing the king from going to g1? Why was the king being on g1 so useful in the first place? Beats me. Knight f3 attacking the queen, so I take the pawn. He blunders another pawn, and now I'm just up 2 pawns. 95. Right? 95. Audience moment. What is a aggressive move that I can play to create a big threat on his king? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is this. Threatening this. And if knight takes c4, I can play knight f2 check. It's not the best move, but king g1 sets up a discovery. And knight to g4, you can just kind of repeat like this, and then you can play b5. And this is very deadly because the king can't move, and I'm just going to get the rest of my pieces involved, right? So knight e5, he goes, he takes, right? And then I decide not to do this because I don't really see any good response after this. So instead I castle, I take, and then I go here. I'm like, well, I can get this way, and then I'm going to attack the pawn this way. Knight to c4, attacking the rook, and apparently I should have gone here. Apparently I should have gone here, but rook c2 is inaccurate because rook here, and if I trade, then that sets up this against my king, which he gets in a different version because this happens, and then I play king to d7, which is apparently a huge mistake. Audience moment, how can he turn the tables and start attacking my king? With a check. And if you would have figured out, the answer is 95. And another follow-up audience moment. What is the best move for the king here? And if you're able to figure it out, the answer is king e7, rook c7 check. Now, what is the best move for the king? There's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 options. One of them is clearly above all the others. Which one is it? If you're able to figure it out, the answer is king to d6. Because you may be like, well, I hang this, but that attacks the rook. So if you want to clear that up, right? You want to take with the rook so that nothing's in danger. Rook to c8. Black can launch their own attack. That is the goal of king to d6, to hit both the pieces, force the rook to take, and then take the c file. And then after rook to d7 check, king c5, force him to step in the way of the rook, then g3. Game goes on, right? But I played king f6, blundering mate in 1. The final audience moment. I know there's been a lot in a row. Find the checkmate in 1. And if you're able to figure it out, Barry lands the triumphant rook. Takes f7. Knight and rook. He commented at the end of the game. Knight and rook, when you can get a knight down here and a rook like this, it's over for black. And I cannot help but agree after this game. Folks, I have been the amazing Haley, and I will see you in the next video.